In the year 1762, the cobblestone streets of Toulouse, France, bore witness to a tragedy that would forever stain the legacy of European justice. But to understand the true horror of that moment, we must ascend into the shadowed history that preceded it. Deep beneath the stone fortresses and towering cathedrals of the Middle Ages, there existed a world of calculated cruelty, where the air was perpetually stale and the only light came from the flickering torches of executioners. It was here, in these subterranean chambers of interrogation, that the iron chair reigned supreme as a monarch of misery. This device, often referred to by historians as the chair of torture or the Judas chair in its various iterations, was not merely an instrument of physical destruction, but a masterpiece of psychological terror designed to shatter the human spirit long before the body finally succumbed. The mere sight of it was often enough to induce a complete mental collapse in the accused. Imagine the scene. A prisoner, already weakened by the squalid conditions of a medieval dungeon, is dragged into the interrogation room. Through the gloom, they see what looks like a heavy, high-backed armchair made entirely of iron. As they are forced closer, the torchlight glints off the surface, revealing the horrific truth. The seat, the backrest, the armrests, and even the leg restraints are thickly studded with hundreds of sharp iron spikes. This was the iron chair, a device engineered to turn the simple act of sitting into an agonizing ordeal that defied description. The architecture of this mechanical nightmare was consistent across the continent, from the torture chambers of the German states to the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition. While local blacksmiths and torturers might add their own gruesome modifications, the core design remained terrifyingly simple. The chair was typically crafted with between 500 and 1,500 spikes, each one filed to a point that was sharp enough to puncture the skin but blunt enough to avoid piercing a major artery immediately. This was a crucial distinction in the grim science of medieval interrogation. The goal was not a swift execution, but a prolonged period of excruciating suffering that could last for hours or even days. The victim was stripped and forced onto the chair, their flesh pressing against a bed of nails. Heavy leather straps or iron manacles would then be used to bind their wrists to the armrests and their ankles to the legs of the chair. In some particularly sadistic variations, a system of screw clamps was employed to slowly tighten the restraints, driving the spikes deeper into the victim's limbs and back with every turn of the screw. As if the piercing iron was not enough, the torturers often employed weights to increase the agony. Heavy stones or lead weights would be placed on the victim's thighs or suspended from their feet, increasing the gravitational force that pulled their body down onto the relentless points. Yet, the true genius of the iron chair's cruelty lay in its ability to incorporate multiple elements of torture simultaneously. Beneath the seat of the chair, there was almost always a hollow space or a grate. This was not an accidental design feature. It was a space reserved for fire. Once the victim was immobilized on the spikes, the executioner would slide a pan of red-hot coals or a burning brazier into the space directly under the seat. The iron of the chair, being an excellent conductor of heat, would begin to warm rapidly. Within minutes, the metal points piercing the victim's skin would become searingly hot, cauterizing the wounds as they were made and preventing blood loss, which only served to prolong the consciousness and suffering of the condemned. The victim was thus trapped in a paradox of pain. If they tried to lift their body to escape the searing heat rising from below, they would have to push harder against the spikes on the armrests and leg rests. If they tried to relax to relieve the pressure of the spikes, they sank closer to the roasting fire beneath them. It was a furnace of human agony, a situation so hopeless that witnesses described victims howling like animals until their voices simply gave out. To comprehend why such devices were created and used with such frequency, one must understand the legal landscape of medieval and early modern Europe. In the eyes of the courts, from the ecclesiastical tribunals of the church to the secular courts of kings and dukes, confession was the queen of proofs. Circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and physical clues were often deemed insufficient for conviction in capital crimes such as heresy, witchcraft, or treason. The system required the accused to admit their guilt with their own lips for the judgment to be considered valid and righteous. This legal philosophy transformed torture from a punitive measure into a procedural necessity, a method of gathering evidence that was as standard as a modern deposition. The iron chair was therefore an investigative tool. Interrogators believed, or claimed to believe, that pain would strip away the lies of the guilty and force the truth to the surface. However, the reality was far more tragic. The intense physiological and psychological stress induced by the iron chair meant that the accused would say absolutely anything to stop the pain. The historical records are filled with transcripts of confessions that are clearly the delirious ramblings of broken people, admitting to flying on broomsticks, conspiring with demons, or plotting crimes that never took place. The chair did not extract truth. It manufactured guilt. The psychological impact of the device began long before the physical torture commenced. It was standard practice to force a new prisoner to watch the torture of another. They would be made to stand in the corner of the chamber, watching as a fellow human being was strapped into the iron embrace of the chair. They would hear the screams, smell the scent of singed flesh and burning coal, and see the bloody aftermath when the victim was finally pulled from the spikes. This technique was devastatingly effective. Many prisoners, having witnessed the reality of the iron chair, would capitulate immediately, confessing the crimes they had not committed simply to avoid occupying that terrible seat. For those who did not confess immediately, the torture followed a grim rhythm. The first phase might last only a short while, a light application of pressure. If the accused remained silent or maintained their innocence, the session would escalate. Weights would be added. The fire would be stoked. The restraints would be tightened. The sessions could be spread out over days, with the victim thrown back into a cold cell to stiffen and suffer in between bouts of interrogation, a practice designed to prevent them from recovering their mental fortitude. One of the most infamous chapters in the history of the iron chair involves the Spanish Inquisition, a tribunal established to maintain Catholic orthodoxy in the Spanish kingdoms. The inquisitors were known for their bureaucratic efficiency and their willingness to employ extreme measures to root out heretics, conversos, and blasphemers. In the torture chambers of cities like Toledo and Cuenca, the iron chair was a staple. The Spanish variant often included additional features, such as a head restraint that forced the victim's head back against spikes on a headrest, or a mouth opener, the pair of anguish, used in conjunction with a chair to prevent screaming or to pour water down the throat. The Inquisition kept meticulous records, and these documents reveal that the chair was used on men and women alike, often for suspected crimes that today would be considered matters of personal conscience. The duration of the suffering was entirely at the discretion of the inquisitor, who viewed the pain as a way to purify the soul of the accused, or at least to save the community from their alleged wickedness. Returning to the year 1762, we find the haunting case of Jean Calas in France, a merchant who became one of the most well-documented victims of this judicial barbarism. Calas was a Protestant living in a largely Catholic society, and when his son died by suicide, rumors swirled that Calas had murdered him to prevent a conversion to Catholicism. Despite the lack of credible evidence, the local magistrates, driven by religious prejudice, ordered Calas to be subjected to the question extraordinary. This legal term was a euphemism for the most severe forms of torture available. Historical accounts detail that Calas was subjected to various tortures, including the stretching rack and water torture, but many sources indicate the presence and threat of devices like the iron chair in the arsenal of the Toulouse executioners. The agony inflicted upon this 64-year-old man was unimaginable. His limbs were pulled from their sockets, and his body was subjected to crushing pressure. Yet, through it all, Jean Calas demonstrated a superhuman resolve. He refused to confess to a crime he did not commit. He maintained his innocence even as his body was broken beyond repair. The judges, frustrated by his silence but determined to see him punished, sentenced him to be broken on the wheel. On March 10, 1762, Calas was executed, his innocence still on his lips. The death of Jean Calas might have been just another forgotten footnote in the long, bloody history of legal torture if not for the intervention of the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. When Voltaire heard the case, he was struck by the palpable injustice and the fanaticism that drove it. He launched a public campaign to clear Calas' name, using the case to highlight the absurdity and immorality of using torture as a means of finding truth. Voltaire argued that torture was a relic of a barbarous past, a method that condemned the weak-bodied innocent and exonerated the strong-bodied guilty. His tireless efforts led to a posthumous exoneration of Jean Calas in 1765 by the King's Council, a landmark victory that sent shockwaves through the European legal system. It was the beginning of the end for the iron chair and its kin. The ideas of the Enlightenment championed by thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in his treatise On Crimes and Punishments, began to permeate the courts of Europe. Beccaria eloquently argued that torture was useless because pain is a sensation, not a logical filter for truth. A person in agony will say whatever is necessary to stop the suffering. Slowly, the laws began to change. In 1780, King Louis XVI of France abolished preparatory question, torture used to extract a confession before sentencing. And in 1788, he abolished preliminary question, torture used to get names of accomplices. It is supreme irony of history that this same king would face the guillotine just a few years later during the French Revolution, a period that brought its own form of terror, yet sought to distance itself from the medieval torture chambers of the Ancien Regime. By the 19th century, the iron chair had largely been retired from active service, moving from the dungeons to the museums and private collections of macabre curiosities. Today, you can see examples of the iron chair museums across Europe, from the Torture Museum in Amsterdam to displays in ancient castles in Germany and Italy. Stripped of the smell of fear and the heat of the coals, they sit in quiet galleries, looking like strange, industrial artifacts. Yet, as we gaze upon the rusted iron and the dull points of the spikes, we are reminded of the terrifying capacity of human ingenuity when it is directed toward cruelty. The iron chair stands as a somber monument to a time when justice was blind not in its impartiality, but in its fury. It serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the fallacy of believing that truth can ever be extracted through coercion. The legacy of the iron chair is not just in the pain it caused to the thousands who sat upon it, but in the lesson it teaches the living, that the pursuit of justice must never come at the cost of our humanity, and that the methods we use to enforce the law are as important as the laws themselves. We look back at the shadowed depths of those medieval chambers not with nostalgia, but with a solemn vow to remember the victims of the iron chair, ensuring that such instrument of darkness remain forever in the past.